happened. Mattis went to the White House this morning to discuss Syria, and he was livid. That's the word used. Barbara Starr is out front now from the Pentagon. And Barbara, what more are you hearing about this? How he went to this meeting, and obviously the letter was prepared, to be used if he needed it. You're reporting he was livid. Why?
Well, Aaron, what we know is that early this morning, about 7:30, the secretary here at the Pentagon decided he needed to go to the White House later in the day. He had seen some reporting from Turkey that the Turks were in fact planning to move against the U.S. Kurdish allies inside Syria. This becomes the critical question, the critical red line perhaps for Jim Mattis, because by the president's decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria leaves those Kurdish fighters that the U.S. had pledged to support. It leaves them abandoned. It leaves them at risk. Mattis is a military man of 40 years. You do not leave your friends on the battlefield. And that's the position President Trump put him in. So he met with President Trump later in the day, about 3 o'clock, we're told, at the White House, tried to convince the president one last time to change his mind about Syria. The president did not, and it is at that point that Mattis had no option in his mind but to resign. This is not a surprise if you know Jim Mattis. It perhaps surprising that it didn't happen before this, but he also tonight knows that the president is seriously considering a drawdown of U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and that will leave Afghan forces behind that the U.S. had pledged to support. So that is part of the reason you see the construct of Mattis's letter. You see him make a strong case for alliances. You see him make a strong case that you have to push back against countries like Russia and China. And Mattis knows that the terrorism fight is far from over, that Russia and Iran are bad actors in this, and that ISIS and the Taliban, when the U.S. is not there, will be on the rise.
So Barbara, obviously the crucial thing here is, you have someone standing saying they are resigning on principle, right? Because they cannot stand with the president of the United States. But saying he's going to stay till February. Now, the president of the United States says he wants to get out of Syria until February, unless something changes, and I suppose it could, given how all this is going down. But Jim Mattis is going to have to sign that order, right? He's going to have to sign the order to withdraw the troops from Syria. Well, is he going to sign it?
Well, that's a good question. What we're talking about is something called an execute order. This is a document to be signed by a Secretary of Defense that puts forces on the move. This is a very typical procedure. It happened when they sent U.S. troops to the southern border. So yes, as Secretary of Defense, Mattis would most likely discharge his responsibilities, or he could say that I just can't do it in good conscience, and that order could be signed by the Deputy Secretary of Defense. That will be the order that details how it happens. The big question is, how do you get 2,600 U.S. troops, which is a relatively small number, out of a war zone with all of their equipment, with ISIS there, with the Syrian regime there, the Russians there, with Iranian militias there? How do you get U.S. troops out of there safely? That is the plan that is being worked on right now at the Pentagon, and that is what the execute order will talk about. Mattis can sign it, or he can have someone else sign it.
I want to go now to former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, also, of course, former chief of the CIA. You've been here, though, in the Defense Department, running a Defense Department. When you saw the letter today, you read it, Secretary. What did you think?
I felt that Jim Mattis did a great job expressing what he's about, the elements of leadership that he represents as Secretary of Defense and throughout his military career, and that he reached the conclusion that those principles that he's lived with for 40 years are not in alignment with the views of this president, which says an awful lot about the differences here between Jim Mattis and the president. And it also raises concerns about where do we go from here. So
obviously you know him, right? Mattis was commander at U.S. Central Command when you became Defense Secretary. You've worked with him. You know his ethics, his morals. You know what kind of a person and a human being he is. When he writes in a letter that His views on treating allies with respect and being clear-eyed about malign actors, which he lays out specifically, are authoritarian regimes. He names Russia and China. What does it say to you that he's actually saying this? He's saying the President of the United States is not treating allies with respect. He's saying the President of the United States has admiration or support or whatever it might be for authoritarian regimes. What does it take for Jim Mattis to come out and say these things?
Well, Jim Mattis is expressing, I think, the principles that this country has stood by since the end of World War II. We have provided world leadership. We have always supported our alliances. We have worked together to protect the security of this country. And he's saying on those basic principles that have been the foundation for American foreign policy and for national security policy, that they are not in alignment with this president, who basically decided on his own, without talking to any military advisors, that he would suddenly withdraw troops from a critical area in the Middle East and leave our allies, the Kurds, exposed. That, I think, is the exact opposite of what a Jim Mattis believes in and what he believes is important for our national defense. And that's why he resigned.
So, you know, Mattis took this job as defense secretary knowing the person that he was serving, right? I mean, he knew a lot of things about Donald Trump, probably that he found personally, malignant. However, he took the job, and he knew today that what he was doing would send shockwaves around the world. He knows full well that he's perceived as a bulwark in this administration for many around the world. He took that very seriously. What do you think, Secretary, about how bad it must have been? What must have really happened in that conversation for him to quit right now?
Well, you know, look, this country right now is going through a steady diet of chaos and crisis. We're about to see the shutdown of the federal government coming at Christmas time. We've seen the president withdraw troops from a critical area in the Middle East. We've now seen the resignation of our Secretary of Defense. And oh, by the way, the stock market is crashing as well. There is a steady diet of chaos that is going on that I think puts our nation at risk. And I think Jim Mattis, to a large extent, sensed that degree of chaos and recognized as a man of integrity that there comes a time when the Secretary of Defense has to stand up for what he believes. That's who Jim Mattis is, and I think that's what he did today.
You know, the slam at the president, the rebuke over the Syria decision, right? This last decision here that it has been overwhelming. It has been bipartisan. It has been from his own administration, right? Jim Mattis vehemently counseled him not to do it. John Bolton, Mike Pompeo said not to do it. Sources inside the administration said it was a mistake of colossal proportions. Never mind all the Republicans on Capitol Hill, right? Saying American lives are going to be in danger. Even if the president didn't care about Kurds, American lives were going to be in danger. The president did not care. He did it anyway. Jim Mattis quits. Now the president says a successor is going to be named shortly. Secretary Pompeo, who's going to take this job?
You know, look, we're a strong nation, even if we have this kind of erratic and unpredictable president. And I think that ultimately, we'll be able to get through this because of our system of checks and balances. But there's no question that this is a president who doesn't like to sit down with advisors and those experienced in foreign policy and national defense policy and listen to them, listen to their advice. Every president in recent history takes the time to listen to his advisors because they know, frankly, a hell of a lot more than the president does. And so the responsibility here is to listen to that advice and to understand the consequences and what it means to the interests of the United States. But this is a president who operates by somehow his gut instinct, and also, I think, how he reads the politics of the moment. He enjoys chaos because he thinks chaos produces attention for him. But the problem is chaos, a steady diet of chaos, creates hell for the American people. We need stability right now. We need a sense that we have a president who's going to take the time to make the right decisions and provide stability for this country. If the president doesn't begin to do that, then I think there's a real question about whether he's implementing the powers and duties of the presidency the way they're supposed to be.
Were you talking about Article 25?
I'm talking about whether or not this president is going to provide the kind of stable leadership that this country desperately needs right now. The last damn thing we need is more chaos and crisis.